Welcome to Lecture 8 of BIB102 New Testament Survey. Today we are going to be finishing up the Gospel of Luke by going through many parables that are unique to him and many miracles that are unique to his writing. So let's get started. Continuing where we left off in the last lecture, with the parables unique to Luke, number 4, only Luke records the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost boy. Now, every one of these, all three of them, are very similar, and as I told you in the very beginning of this class, Luke is not written chronologically, so he topically decided to put these three similar parables together. The parable of the lost sheep deals with a shepherd who has 100 sheep. If one wanders off, Jesus said that shepherd will leave the 99 to go find that one lost sheep. The parable of the lost coin is with a woman who has 10 coins and she loses one of them. And Jesus said she will do anything she can to find that missing silver coin. And then the last one, the parable of the lost son, this is most commonly called the prodigal son. This is when the younger of two sons asks his father for his inheritance now. The father agrees, gives him his portion of the inheritance, and then goes and lives an immoral life and ends up spending and wasting it all. In fact, his job becomes working with pigs and eating their food, which, if you know anything about a Jewish culture, pigs are unclean animals. So he's gone down to the lowest of lows. And this actually caused him to remember that even his father's servants had better lives than he did right then. So he decided he was going to go back home and ask his father to just be a servant, since he already had his inheritance and no longer had a right to be his son. Upon arrival, the father sees him walking. He runs to him, embraces him, and rejoices that he's home. In fact, he even has a party thrown in his favor. Now, the older brother, he notices this is going on and he gets very upset about this. But thankfully, the father explains that all of this was because the younger son was lost, but now he's found. The application here is that heaven rejoices over the repentance of a sinner and not the self-righteousness of a saint. That repentance of a sinner was the younger son. The self-righteousness of a saint was that older son. And if you know the context of these stories, Jesus is actually speaking to a multitude of people, and the Pharisees are there listening. And he's actually trying to let them realize that the older brother is the Pharisees. Number 5, only Luke records the parable of the unjust steward. In this parable, Jesus tells us there once was an unjust steward who was supposed to give an account of all of his master's money. Now, a steward is somebody who has the responsibility of managing funds. Now, since this individual had not done well managing the money, he devised a plan to work out deals with those who owed his master, and then at least collect something from them instead of all they owed. Then, when the master came, the unjust servant gave him so much money that the master commended him and actually gave him more responsibility because he had wisely managed his finances. Now, you and I may see this and think, wait a second, he was an unjust steward. But there's actually two applications here. I've given you one, that God will reward faithfulness in the temporal with greater responsibility in the eternal, which is true. With what God gives us to work with on earth, the responsibilities he gives us, that is going to echo into eternity. But the other application is this. It's not how you start your walk with Christ. It's how you end. Because you may start off like the unjust steward and not fulfill the responsibilities God's given you. But then you come to a realization that one day you're going to have to meet your master and have to give an account. And then you decide you're going to take care of the responsibilities he's given you. And then he will reward you. Number 6, only Luke records the parable of the unjust judge. In this parable, Jesus tells us that there was a widow who kept coming to a judge over and over and over to avenge her for some wrong that had been done. And because of her persistence, and not because the judge feared God, the judge ends up avenging her of the wrong that was done to her. Now, in verse 2 of chapter 18 in Luke, we find that this parable was said to teach us to always pray and never give up. Therefore, The just father will always avenge his children. The application here is our prayers to the Father will not go unanswered. If an unjust judge will avenge a widow because of persistence, just remember, when you are wronged, you don't have to beg God. He will avenge you of the wrong that was done to you. And finally, the last parable that we're going to discuss in this lecture that's unique to Luke is number 7. Only Luke records the parable of the Pharisee and tax collector. Jesus tells us in this parable that there once was a Pharisee and a tax collector that both went into the temple to pray to God. The Pharisee prayed and thanked God that he was not like the bad people, and especially not like the tax collector next to him. And he thanked God that he had fasted twice a week and gave tithes of all of his possession, while the tax collector humbly put his face on the ground, hit himself on the chest, and begged God to be merciful to him. Now, in this parable, one was self-righteous in his prayers, and the other was Christ righteous, was God righteous. The application here is righteousness comes from humility, not self-centeredness. And that concludes the section on the parables unique to Luke. Let's look at the last section for Luke, letter E. Miracles unique to Luke. Number 1. Only Luke records a certain miraculous catch of fish. Now, because of Jesus' miracles that he was performing in Luke 5, we find that many individuals are following him, so he used what we call the acoustics of a lake to teach the people. He got into Simon Peter's boat, tells them to cast off a bit, and teaches them literally from the middle of a lake, and allowed the acoustics to his voice to travel off the waves, the water, to the people's ears. Now, after teaching them, he tells Peter to cast down his nets. But Peter says that they had not caught anything all night. However, he would do it anyway. So he obeyed, cast his nets into the water, and caught a great number of fish. This is what caused Peter, James, and John to be recorded as forsaking all and following Jesus. This is also when Jesus tells Peter now he will be a fisher of men. Number 2. Only Luke records the widow of Nain's son being raised to life. Now, when Jesus and the people reach a city called Nain, there is a funeral procession going on outside for the only son of a widow. Now, this caused Jesus to have great compassion on her and tells her to weep not, and tells the son to arise. And when the son literally arises from the dead, this caused others to realize that God truly was with them. Number 3, only Luke records the healing of the woman with an 18-year infirmity on the Sabbath. Now, this individual, she had been sick for 18 years and could not even lift herself up anymore because Luke records she had been crippled by an evil spirit. When Jesus sees her, he says that she was loosed from her sickness. He laid his hands on her and she was immediately healed. Unfortunately, the ruler of the synagogue was upset because he had done this on a Sabbath. But Jesus pointed out the hypocrisy that he, the ruler of the Sabbath, the ruler of the synagogue, would loose his oxen and sheep to be fed on the Sabbath, but he was opposed to loosing this woman from her bonds of Satan on the Sabbath. Number 4, only Luke records the healing of the man with dropsy. Now, the dropsy was a swelling due to the buildup of fluid in the tissues and cavities of the hands and the elbows and the feet and major joints. Now, Jesus heals this man, but it's on the Sabbath, and of course, this raised questions from the Pharisees. Jesus then responds to their questioning of him by asking if one of their oxen or donkeys fell into a pit, would they pull him out on the Sabbath? Interestingly, They would not answer. Just like number 3, the ruler of the synagogue. My suspicion has always been that that was a common practice to lay aside Sabbath laws if it was for the betterment of a business, which again is extremely hypocritical of these individuals to question Jesus for healing people for their own good when they had no problem violating the Sabbath law for their own good. Number 5, only Luke records the cleansing of the 10 lepers. In this miracle story, Luke tells us that Jesus healed 10 lepers in Samaria. Now, a leper in the Old Testament and New Testament time, that was a term for a disease that had a wide variety of ailments. Today, leprosy is limited to a specific type of skin disease, and actually it's a blood circulation disorder. But of this time, these individuals, whatever type of leprosy they would have been outcast and to society and not allowed to be around anybody that they knew for fear of spreading that disease. That's why they were all together, because they were all ailing with the same symptoms, the same disease. Well, Jesus goes to these 10 lepers, heals them. It tells them to go show themselves to the priests to be declared clean so they could go back into society. Interestingly, Luke tells us out of those 10, only one came back to thank Jesus for the healing, which to me is unbelievable that 9 of them were healed of a disease that kept them from being a part of society, but they never came back to say thanks to the one who made it possible. Lastly, number 6. Only Luke records the reattaching of the high priest servant's ear. Now, if you remember from earlier lectures, the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, only tell us that a disciple cut off a high priest servant's ear. Thankfully, we know from John. John says it was Peter who cut off the ear of a man named Malchus. Well, Luke actually tells us a really cool aspect of the story. He says that after this event happened, Jesus actually took the ear, placed it back on Malchus's head, and it immediately became whole again. Now, for me, I always find this humorous just because if I was Malchus, I would have been like, you know what, guys, let's don't arrest him. He just put my ear back on, and I think that's a cool thing. So, because I don't want to look like Van Gogh for the rest of my life. But most likely because of the commotion that was going on while Malchus' ear is getting put on, most people probably didn't even see this or notice it, and they went on with arresting Jesus. Now that we've come to the conclusion of the Gospel of Luke, test number 2 will be during the next class period, and it will cover the material from Matthew on page 11 of your student notebook to Luke at the end of page 21 of your student notebook. As a reminder, if you have not made up test number 1, that must be completed before taking test number 2, or test number 1 automatically retains that 0 in the record books. Well, that brings us to the end of this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or you need anything, please do not hesitate to ask.